We ask the question, what is needed in the world? Is that going to be?
As we begin a new year, the UN forecasts a lower global economic growth because of the pandemic, labor shortages, supply chain issues and rising inflation. For the Argentinian economy, with a long history of economic crisis, this will pose an even bigger challenge. The South American nation is just weeks away from a deadline to restructure its debt with the International Monetary Fund. Failing to do so could cut off access to most of the international financial institutions, putting even more pressure on its already struggling economy. The debt dates back to 2018, when then-President Mauricio Macri signed on to a $57 billion loan, the largest in the IMF history. His successor, President Alberto Fernandez, inherited a debt of some $44 billion. Fernandez rejected the terms of the agreement and sent his finance minister Martín Guzman to renegotiate. So will he succeed? And will the country ever resolve its year-long financial crisis? Argentina's finance minister Martín Guzman talks to Al Jazeera. Minister Martín Guzman, thanks so much for talking to Al Jazeera. It's been a very difficult year for countries around the world. Argentina is also included in that list of countries. It's currently under negotiations with the IMF. When do you think an agreement could be reached?
Well, we're working on it. Every minute counts. This is, of course, like any international negotiation of that, a complex negotiation with many countries involved, with the IMF, which is an institution, which is a complex institution that is facing a massive challenge, like Argentina is facing a massive challenge, which is the capacity of reaching an agreement to refinance, which was the highest loan in the history of the IMF, the largest loan in the history of the IMF, a $57 billion loan, out of which almost $45 billion were disbursed. So we are right now in negotiations, and what Argentina is trying to achieve is an agreement that doesn't jeopardize the very strong economic recovery that the country is going through. Argentina in 2021 was one of the countries in the world that had the fastest recovery. Actually, the country from the G20 with the highest rate of economic growth. The economy will have grown by 10% in 2021. Employment is growing significantly. Investment will have grown by 35%. Our exports are growing. But the main burden for continuing alongside the path of economic recovery in 2022 is the debt with the IMF. So this is sort of an ironic situation. The IMF is supposed to assist countries in situations of balance of payment crisis. In Argentina, the tension in the balance of payment is the IMF. And all we are asking the international support for is to support our views for just having Argentina alongside the track of the economic recovery that now is occurring.
Why is the negotiation so difficult? I mean, Argentina has to pay this year $19 billion. I mean, what are the discrepancies that exist in order to reach an agreement?
Well, first, it's difficult because of the size of the loan and because of what happens before. In 2018, there was a loan that many saw as a political loan, as the support of a multilateral institution to a government, so that government could win the elections. And that created a lot of anxiety, it created many problems, and the economic program that was implemented did not work. It deteriorated the economic and the social situation. Unemployment grew, economic activity fell, poverty increased, inflation increased. There was an evaluation from the IMF recently called the ex-post program evaluation, which was a very important document that revealed that the IMF recognizes that the program was a failure, that it did not achieve any of its objectives, that the entire economic and social situation got worse, and that it was based on foundations that were not appropriate for Argentina's economy. The evaluation of the IMF recognized, to begin with, that there should have been a debt operation to restore the sustainability of the public debt in foreign currency, and that there should have been capital account regulations in order to avoid what actually happened. The entire loan, those $45 billion, were used to pay unsustainable debt to foreign creditors and to finance a massive formation of foreign assets. About $24 billion constituted a capital flight financed by the IMF. And in this context, the process of the creation of common understandings in the international community becomes very important. There's something interesting in the communique of the IMF board about the ex-post program evaluation, which is that it says that directors basically support the conclusions of that report, but it says a number of directors do not. So what we see now is that it has proved difficult to achieve international consensus on what's the right path forward and on having common understanding on what happened in the past. And these differences within the international community is what's preventing the IMF from achieving the consensus it needs to support what Argentina is trying to adopt.
There's big differences between members of the IMF, of those who support what Argentina is proposing and those who don't. What is the dispute about? I mean, what are they discussing and what is Argentina proposing?
Well, there are differences of interest to begin with, and there may be differences in views as well. What Argentina is proposing is to have a program that is consistent, that has as a main goal the continuity of economic growth, and that fosters job creation, and that helps us to reduce the most significant social problems that we have in our economy. Most importantly, the child poverty. Our population under 14 years old, we have about 54% of the population in that age range in a situation of poverty, which is a very important social problem for our economy. And about 40% of our population is in situation of poverty overall. We need the economy to grow. An economy that doesn't grow is an economy that doesn't resolve its social problems. And that's the kind of program that we have been implementing, and it's working. The economy is growing now. There's job creation in the economy, very significant, and poverty is getting reduced. The main difference is the fiscal path. What we are proposing is a fiscal path that, in our view, will help Argentina not only to give continuity to the economic recovery in the short term, but it will also help us to have a more dynamic market economy, an economy that builds dynamic comparative advantages, that has more creation of value, that has more public infrastructure, and that has a better capacity to invest in science, in technological developments. Our view is that the kind of fiscal path that the IMF is proposing will bring troubles. There are differences. The IMF wants a faster path of a faster fiscal consolidation than what Argentina is proposing, and we think that will affect the recovery in the short term, but also the capacity of the economy to grow in the medium and long term. And there is particularly one aspect that the IMF has been emphasizing. The IMF wants less investment in public capital, basically capital spending, than what Argentina is proposing. And for us, capital spending is of the essence. Today, the countries in the world that manage to have more vibrant economies are those that have more abundance in what is not mobile across borders. Of course, knowledge and the institutions that create knowledge, but also public infrastructure.
Do you think that with this negotiation, there's a chance to change the way the IMF implements its programs? I mean, we know that many of the austerity measures implemented by the IMF has not worked in many countries around the world. So do you think that this negotiation could be, in a way of changing the way the IMF implements some of its programs?
Well, this is going to be, it is a historic negotiation, and it will, to a large extent, determine the face that the IMF will have in the next few years in a world that is full of problems, in a world that is evolving, and in which multilateralism needs to evolve. And the IMF also needs to evolve, and needs to have the adaptability to evolve. Certainly, we know that fiscal austerity in context of countries that have been in recessions, like it happened in Argentina. Argentina had a recession in 4 out of the last 5 years, and now, I mean, I'm not counting 2021, right? So from 2016 to 2020, and in 2021, it's recovering. Austerity now, which just undermined the recovery. So the point is what works and what doesn't. And there are, influential stakeholders that have different views. And also here, the financial markets are part of the picture, and many think that it is better to have an economy that implements a program of fiscal adjustment, but not just reduction of the deficit, which we are doing, and this is something that is very important to see. The reduction in fiscal deficit is being very significant, and it's happening on the basis of an economy that recovers. Others push for programs that are contractionary, and the logic of those is that by having a contraction, the country will have lower economic growth and therefore lower imports. And if there are lower imports, there will be more accumulation of foreign exchange reserves. Therefore, market access will be restored earlier. That just doesn't work. That will mean putting the interest of financial market participants ahead of the interest of the Argentine people. No program that is contractionary can be sustained. No government will continue with a program that is contractionary. And what we need now is a healthy multilateralism, one that helps the countries in the world when they are in situations of crisis to resolve the crisis in a way that helps the people of those countries.
You talk about economic growth and how Argentina has recovered in the past year, especially after the pandemic. But Argentina is still a country that has very high inflation, around 50% a year. As you mentioned before, high poverty rates. What's the government's plan in order to fight inflation, to get the economy going, and to actually, for that improvement in the economy to reach the population?
Inflation has been a pervasive problem in Argentina's history. And inflation is the consequence of multiple causes, some of which are structural. Some of the important progress that was achieved in this engagement with the IMF over the last couple of years is reflected in the evaluation that the IMF did of the previous standby agreement of 2018. In this evaluation that was published just a few weeks ago, there is a recognition that inflation is indeed a multifaceted problem. That's how the IMF puts it. And not just a monetary phenomenon, that it cannot be just tackled with a policy of high interest rates. It needs more than that. What does it need? First, it needs a sustained increase in the production of the tradable sector of our economy, right? Our exports need to increase in a sustainable way. That's very important because in Argentina, typically, what creates pressures on the exchange rate are the situations in which the economy grows, but exports do not keep up with the growth of the economy, and that growth puts pressure on the foreign exchange reserves, what in turn puts pressure on the exchange rate and on inflation. So that's a structural issue, changing the structure of production of the economy. That's why it's so important to have productive policies in which the state plays an important role that helps the market economy to have a situation of more dynamism through investments in the right public infrastructure, technological progress, scientific progress. Number two, the fiscal deficit. It has to be reduced, and it's happening. We reduced the fiscal deficit from 6.4% of GDP to 2.9% of GDP. We expect 2.9 to 3 in 2021, the primary deficit. That's remarkable in the context of a pandemic and on the basis of economic growth. It was the economic recovery that led to such a large increase in revenues that made this reduction possible, not the economic contraction, as we're discussing with the IMF. The reduction of the deficit is important to depend less on monetary financing for a country that lost the access to international credit markets in 2018. And the third part of this multifaceted problem has to do with expectations. You can imagine how people grow in a country that has been used to deal with inflation. The mindsets evolve in a way in which when there was inflation in the past, everyone expects inflation in the future. And those expectations sometimes become self-fulfilling. So the state plays an important role in order to coordinate actions between the private sector, the companies, and the workers, the unions, in order to coordinate a decrease of the inflation expectations.
Imagine, I'm asking you, if you're a foreign investor and you're outside of Argentina, and you look at the economy here and you say, it's a country that has had over 20 programs with the IMF, many of which have failed, a country with capital controls, with inflation. What would you say to them to say that this time it's going to be different?
Well, but today there is only upside.
Yeah.
There's only upside because the bond prices are incredibly low. They do not reflect the actual capacity of Argentina for generating incomes in foreign currency. If we measure today GDP per capita of Argentina using the parallel exchange rate, because in the presence of capital controls there is an official exchange rate and a parallel exchange rate, our GDP will be lower than $5,000 per capita. That's not realistic. Argentina is not a low-income country. It's a middle-income country. Everyone understands that that's unrealistic. So there is only upside. The economy is growing. There are investment opportunities. Investment, as I said, we have grown by 35% this year. And actually, there is foreign direct investment today in important sectors of our economy, especially in sectors associated with natural resources that then get industrialized. Argentina is now on the right path. The problems of inflation are problems that are historic, that have multiple causes, and are being addressed. And it will take time. This is an issue. It will take time for Argentina to reduce inflation to levels that are healthy for the workings of the market economy, but we are along that path.
Many of the confrontations that exist today is not only between Argentina and IMF or those negotiations, but also internal problems within the government with different views about how to deal with the IMF. What do you say to this? It's known that the president supports one thing, but then there's an internal dispute with the vice president and many of her supporters who do not want an agreement. How do you explain that?
No, but that's not correct. That's not correct. There are no different views within the governing coalition on what we're trying to achieve with IMF. We want to achieve a deal to be able to refinance the debt that was taken in 2018 and 2019, and that doesn't jeopardize the recovery of Argentina's economy. The reason why we don't have a deal yet is because the IMF has been too slow in achieving the consensus it needs in order to support the need that Argentina needs today.
So supporters of Cristina Fernandez and La Cámpora and other movements, it does not have an impact on what the government is doing right now to negotiate. Because in many cases when you say, yes, an agreement is being reached, many will tell you, and what is Cristina saying about this? So my question is there a joint agreement in this negotiation? But
both the president and the vice president work to protect Argentina, to make Argentina a stronger country. We all work together. And the question is understandable in the sense that there is a lot of noise that we hear from many in the international community, but that noise is unfounded. The real reason why we don't have a deal today is because the IMF is too slow. And we hope we can build the full support of the international community so we can move to a deal, but not any kind of deal. That's the point. There is a principle when it comes to IMF programs that is called ownership. The country has to own the program, not just to validate what others dictate. And what we want is to be able to be the ones that design the program, which we did, and get support for the program that Argentina wants, and it's a program that Argentina will own.
On the negotiation with the IMF, there's several congressmen in the United States that have reached to the Treasury, to try to assist countries, not only Argentina, others, with the surcharges, which is something that generates a big problem for those who own the IMF. Is this realistic? Is it something that would have an impact on the negotiations in Argentina and in other nations across the world?
Well, the surcharges is an issue that is not very well known, or at least it wasn't that well known in the world, and it is becoming more known now, and this is part of the opaqueness associated sometimes with some of the policies in the context of the multilateralism. If you look for precise information about how much countries pay in terms of the surcharges, the interest surcharges that the IMF imposes, you won't find it. This is not available. There is no transparency when it comes to this point. And basically what's happening now is that countries in crisis are financing the operational expenses of the IMF to a large extent. This just makes no sense. This is a policy that is pro-cyclical. It undermines the mission of the IMF because it hurts it deprives countries in crisis from the foreign exchange they need in order to recover. So it basically worsens its balance of payment problems. There are a number of countries that is increasing that are paying these surcharges. And it should be obvious that in the context of the pandemic, they should have been revised. But it didn't happen yet. And many in the international community are supporting a change. And it was very important to see this letter from a number of lawmakers in the US to the sector of the Treasury, explaining that the surcharges basically will make countries in situations that are difficult, they will put these countries in an even more difficult position. This is part of what's happening in the world. We, as a member of the G20, participate of all the discussions at the G20, and what we see is that it is very difficult to achieve consensus on issues on which the benefit to cost ratio is so high in the short term. Surcharges is one obvious case of a policy that should have been revised, but look at what's happening with the vaccines. Right? With the vaccines in the world, there are countries that have very low rates of vaccination because advanced countries have hoarded vaccines. And we haven't managed in the international community to find the right cooperation. So one wonders if it's that difficult to achieve cooperation on things in which the benefits in the short term are so large and so obvious, how we are going to achieve cooperation to deal with issues like climate change, for which the benefits will be seen in terms that are longer.
And one last question. Argentina has been, when you look at the country's history, I mean, we've had one crisis after another. It's like a systematic thing that every 10, 20 years, something happens. What is wrong with Argentina? What is wrong with the economy? What needs to be fixed in order to come out of this permanent crises that happen one after the other?
Well, the main constraint for sustaining economic growth in Argentina has been the lack of dynamism in the exports sector and the high dependence on commodities and the incapability of the economy to transform its structure of production and add more value to its production. But that's what we're changing now, and it is working. If we look at the data for 2021, our exports increased significantly, and this was not just due to the increase in the prices of what we sell to the world. We are experiencing an increase in the volumes, in the quantities of what we sell to the world. That's why it's so important for us to have the support of the international community to be able to give continuity to the set of economic policies that we have been adopting, so we can create a country that has more dynamism, that is more inclusive, that creates more jobs, and that basically makes for an environment in which our people can live in a more calm way.
Thank you very much for talking to Al Jazeera.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.